sit here and we go, hey, hi, how y'all doing? Welcome to another Commodore CES. No, what is this? Christ, I forgot.
This is like the summer show season. It was the Vegas show, but everybody else picks it up.
Welcome to the Vegas user group thing.
Commodore Engineer User Group, free for all.
Right. I'm Bill Hurd, and yes, don't adjust your TV set. I have no hair this time. You're a who?
I'm Dave Haynie, and I still have hair.
He looks exactly like he did when And over here we have a very special person. Guys, sound like we were talking about.
Here's our talk show. Our very special guest.
Well, it's like that episode of Seinfeld, and we're back. And who do we have with us today?
You're all set up for the local cable channel right there, you know.
The guy on my left is Bob Russell, who is a very famous programmer that nobody's heard of. That's probably the best one. No, what Dave and I were talking about this time through is we showed a bunch of hardware last time, and so the programmers of everything really got the short end of the stick. We didn't get the full description. We'd sat here and ate lunch and talked about them behind their back and never really talked about them in front of everybody. So I figured we'd talk about some of the software efforts and some of the programming that went on, and some of the history before we got there. We're from the mid-Commodore area, what you say. And there's kind of the story that I'd hired Dave, and there's a cute little story that goes with it, where he didn't know I was doing the hiring, and he came into the place where we would go and do these all-night gigs after a long day of work. And he walked into the waiting room not knowing I was there to hire, and I'm like, hey, you here for a job? And he's like, yeah, and he tells me all about, he's in a homemade shirt, and tells me all about why he doesn't want to work designing missiles to kill people. And I thought, this is cool. It turns out he had all these math degrees I didn't have and things. And so when he walked into the room to be introduced to me, he already had a job.
Already met.
Yeah. Well, Bob Russell's the guy that got me into Commodore, and it was at the same place. And I'd already interviewed with a guy named Frank Hughes, and me and Frank just didn't. I tried so hard to click with that guy, and I liked him. Later we always got along, but Bob was the guy that he denies that this happened. I think because he doesn't agree with it, but he was mentioning opcodes, and he's going, well, load a media day night, and I'm like, A902. I'm mumbling these mnemonics under my breath, and I saw him kind of glance at me, and he said another one. That's how I know he was testing me. And I mentioned another one, and I saw his shoulders kind of go back, and he's like, well, we'll bring you on in. And I was like, oh, shit, thank goodness. But no, Bob. The problem with Bob Russell, who worked on the VIC-20 and the Commodore 64, is he's so unassuming that those of us that have known him for years still don't know what all he did. We have to beat it out of him. We have to beat stories out, whereas me and Dave, you can't shut us up. But this guy here, he just. So I was hoping to hear some of those stories today. I don't know if he's queued up for any of them. But.
Well, I mean, that's part of the problem that I'm shy is I realize how many, other great people there were that I built on top of just, by yourself you can't achieve. I mean, in the early days there were people, that Bill Seilers and stuff like that played the same roles that you played as the next generation, that if they weren't there, the company never would have gone forward. They were the people who picked up the hardware stuff that somebody had a good idea, but didn't know how to implement it, didn't know how to create it, didn't know how to make it practical, turn into product, and turn things into product. Figure out how to
get it out.
Build something. And we also had a really good team of people that were on the production side that are unsung heroes, and that I don't remember their names. We had a whole lot of people up at the front. There was the drafting team and people that worked up there that were crucial in the early days because you were a self-contained organization. It wasn't no subcontracting, go out and have somebody build something for you. You kind of did it yourself.
You did the taping, and I remember Sue was in the drafting team when I first came there, and that was it. It was like one.
And in the very early days, of course, most of the product was being built in the backside of the factory that we were in when we were doing the design. We were just the front half was just the development. So you had your production staff that was kind of on almost equal footing in the early days because the building was split down the middle, and on one side was basically the engineering, the other side had a front row of offices with corporate, with Jack, kind of like a row that ended up with Jack at an office down. And right behind the other side of the wall there was the production people, and then there was the production staff. And then the whole back half of the building was the actual manufacturing lines, where you go out there and you'd see the PET boxes rolling around and the disk drives. And when stuff failed, the quality controller test, or if there was just a failure in general, like we were building it before we'd actually completed the design, which happened a few times, the bad units would pile up in the hallway that ran down the middle of the building, that ran basically from manufacturing, and to split the manufacturing / corporate from the development, and they'd pile this stuff up along the walls. So you go down there and you'd see this massive stuff growing along the walls, and the corridor getting narrower and narrower. And you're like, okay, I think we
That's
better
our
solve.
QA, yeah.
We better solve the dual disk drive, 8050 problem or something like that.
Was that you that said somebody was quoted one time as saying that the road between Westchester and King of Prussia was paved with bad big chips? Was that you that just said that they're only sand after all, or something like that? Was quoted in a magazine. So it's does anybody remember the gold C64 story? That reminded me of when we were talking, or what you were talking about, the pile. I just remember the story that somebody goes, well, we need that millionth C64, off the production line, and the guy's going, it's here somewhere. I just know, and it's that big pile that used to be behind the lab. Here it is. Yeah, here's where we put that millionth one. And they take it off. It's even a Type 1 case instead of a Type 2 case, and they sprayed it gold. And just recently, I saw somebody asking, it was an old thread or something I found on Google, but somebody's going, well, I heard it was gold-plated, and they did a hot inject mold, and so, no, it's a can of spray paint and a Type 1 chassis.
You want to make your own million?
Yeah, but it's just the way, here it is, here's where I left it. So, yeah, right before we kicked the cameras on, Bob was talking about what it was like to work with the chip guys, like the Yanis and Charpentier and Sprite. What were you saying about the Sprites?
Oh, yeah, well, it was like when we were making decisions about the VIC chip that was actually in the 64, it was a matter of, 3 guys in an office. I mean, that was the beauty of it, is, you had me from the software side, you had Bob, kind of was like almost the hardware person on it in some respects, and you had Al, who was the chip designer at that time, and, we're discussing, well, how much could we fit on the actual piece of silicon, how big could we make it, where we're going to get into trouble, and then we would go down, kind of like review how the subunits worked and stuff like that, and the chip guys were always about, we've got all these modes that result just from the logic of the chip. So there's a whole bunch of them that don't appear to be useful, so, we'll turn them off. And, kind of like, well, why turn them off? I mean, just because we don't know what to do with them. Just because we're not smart enough to figure out
let's just leave the stuff laying around
as
fodder.
It's just a mode. It's not, if you turn it off, it just means you can never get to it. If you just leave it so you can get to it. So it was really hard to document, to write that original programmer's guide for the 64, because there was a lot of things that were kind of like, well, we know you can do it, but we really don't know how to explain it. It was kind of like, so we created state tables lots of times, and there was like, well, this
we know what this does. We know what that does.
This does something. And
this is before word processors, so after they made the state table, the photocopy of the state table was the only existing document, and we'd use it over and over again. You'd see it get a little more crooked in each document that it would...
Yeah, photocopier running through the blue stink machines.
Well, you remind me of... we tried to get Freddie Bowen here today, and he couldn't make it, but he did the kernel for the +4 and the C128, and he was there before I got there. He was there during your time.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was
an East Coaster originally.
Yeah, he was already out here.
He started out at MOS.
Yeah, because I moved out in 81. Okay,
right.
in the summer of 81, because Jack had hit the wall and being able to hire any more people
that would work for him.
That would actually work for him. So he was trying to convince, somebody to move out to work with the chip designers, because he wanted to do things, and he realized that the chip designers wanted to do things, and he also had just lost Chuck Peddle in that group at that point in time. So it was kind of like a lot of core key people had left. So it's pretty much down to, the old person there being like John Fagan's inside the organization. He was, because all the other of that era had kind of like left at that point in time.
Right.
And, I was John and me, and, actually Shiraz was there at that point in time, even though he really wasn't so much involved with the computer products. He had come in to do calculators, basically the next generation of
I didn't
calculators.
know that. I didn't know that.
So it was one of those cases that, it was more about just like, I need somebody to move to the East Coast, so there's some continuity, so somebody needs to move. So it was, and that's kind of like, that's my fun history, is where, I'm like going, well, I'm not going to move, and I'm going to move, and they had a waiting truck sitting like outside my apartment. They called me up and like, are you ready to move? I was like, no, I'm not moving today. They apparently would call back to the corporate offices, and then they'd like, well, you got to move, Bob. It's like, well, I just rather quit. I don't know what I do. I don't really feel like moving to the East Coast. And they're like, oh, no, you can't quit. You really should move. So I kept hoping they'd sweeten the pot significantly. But it was more about just applying the pressure. So.
Little did you know that your money would go a lot further out east here.
Well, that was the quote thing they were trying to sell me. So the next round.
Instead of hardware, we have sushi here today. You worked on you did the basic or the kernel, or for both, or the VIC-20, the 64?
Well, I was really
bus?
where I kind of like got. I was the very early days. I kind of was a jack of all trades because I started off there. They hired me kind of as a second generation from the very original guys that did the PET, because I went to school with John Fagans and some of the very original people that came out of Iowa State, and I was the next year behind. So they were like there at Commodore doing the early PET stuff, and then I followed really the following year. And, they were like, well, we had all the development tools, and one of the few people actually had 6502 development tools those days, because they were unique and expensive and complicated.
System 65 was the only one.
I actually had a lab that had one, and it was the type of thing where, since we were a brand new curriculum at that university, we got to define what the courses were. So we designed a course around programming the 6502 with that particular device. So it's kind of like we built a course that proved that we could actually use it. So it was a matter of, I had a ready job, went out there and spent a week writing test programs to basically verify that a PET computer was functional. And I wrote this humongous, great, big, complicated, scared the heck out of the production people, and they're going like, well, why don't you go actually, write software on the development side?
Right. Stop doing that.
Yeah, exactly. That's like too much, Bob. We don't want you to help us anymore. So I worked a little bit. I worked with the guys on the disk drives when we were doing the dual controller drives, and there were lots of problems with straightening things out because,
Well, not to jump ahead, but the serial bus in the Commodore 1540.
But you see, I realize that's all where I had the basis.
Well, now's your moment to come clean. Tell us about the serial bus and the speed of the serial bus.
Well, that was
faster than typing.
That was one of the things that since I had worked on the drive stuff, I knew how the IEEE stuff worked.
Right.
Okay, and that's what, of course, we really wanted and thought there'd be some type of a parallel bus to make things work. But everybody told us, no, it's got to be a simpler bus, so we'll use the 6522.
If nothing else, the connector's cheaper. That would have been the kind of logic.
It was a smaller thing, and we already had a single drive, right, which was still pretty much a dual drive controller, right? It was the equivalent of what a 2040 was, only now it's, one board and one, It started off as being actually just a sheet metal drive, but those failed. They only lasted like hundreds of hours. So it wasn't exactly something
the stamped drive.
The stamped drive. So it's like we tried. That was built around the stamped drive. Was the original concept for that. So basically, what happened is I was doing the kernel work for the 6502 on the VIC, and had figured out that I wanted to have like a serial port, so we could do a modem or whatever.
Right.
It was a serial thing. Actually, it was kind of before modem because Dennis Hayes came in and worked with me on building the first modem.
His time frame when he says modem. That's how we used to say it. It was modulator, demodulator,
and it's the type of thing where I was doing all the we called it the kernel because it was basically all the maintenance support routines to actually make basic function. Have a screen that actually, was a quote screen editor.
Right.
Provide all those functionalities and stuff like that. Except we had split it into its own piece of code.
First screen editor. We were just talking about that earlier. It's first screen editor out there.
So the stuff is that I had done my kernel side, and I had written like serial routines, and I had gotten together with Chuck Peddle and actually documented and figured out how the cassette worked and stuff like that, because it was undocumented. It was just code, and Chuck was the only one that had the slightest clue as to what it was.
And he was a scientist, right? I mean, so it was kind of...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he was more of a chip designer than he was a code writer. So
right.
He apparently was the only person available to write it when they did the original pets. That's what he did. So anyway, it turned out that we had the product done, and Jack wanted to make it basically start shipping in Japan, like in a month or something like that. I mean, some ridiculously tight schedule. And we had the first units back, and we had the first code all up and running. And Bob Fairbairn, who was supposed to have been the guy working on the drive part with Glenn, and I can't remember the other guy's name right now, but the two other guys were the main drive people. They were at the More Apart group, which were the toy group, the special.
Is that where Ultramax came from?
No, the Ultramax was actually later.
Okay.
So the toy was the 40 column.
Oh, the toy, yeah, okay.
The 40 column.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Precursor to, it was going to replace the big pet, and was going to be the tool of intellects, or whatever. So it was the Apple equivalent, an Apple II equivalent type machine class, and so they would have been off working on their own, and Bob Fairbairn had kind of been spared from that group to do that piece of the thing. Well, I mean, he plugged it in, and it just kept locking up. I mean, every time there was a failure, the 6522, had a flaw, and it would lock up. And the problem is, it not only locked up the drive, so it wasn't just a matter of turning the drive on and off. It locked both machines up, and when you're in the middle of a load and the machines are locked up, the only thing you have is a power on and off switch. Not a lot of options left there.
So the reason why the serial bus is slow was software fixed it, but it was hardware that was broken.
Software fixed it, hardware was broken, and I had a week to write it. And Jack, looked at me and said, "You're going to solve that, right? You got a week." And it's like, "Yes, sir."
Gil Moyer used to tell the story like, "It'll be sitting right here, puff, puff. It'll be sitting right here come Monday morning," and like they said, "Yes, sir," type thing. It's like, I saw what was wrong with that chip. We were pulling out schematics, and I was talking with Michael Angelina, who's no longer with us. But there was a node, and I had Dave Dioria did the interpretation for me. There was a node that would float, just kind of drift on up inside the 6522 when it was on input mode. And then when you went to turn it to an output, it should have just quietly gone to an output, and would it go, oh, boom, and it would bark out the pin. And everybody'd say what? And they'd like you said, the whole bus would lock up. So,
wow.
But everybody blamed the software people for the slow serial bus. I mean, that's still the question I hear. And basically, what you did was make it so it was shippable.
Yeah, I made it so.
Which counts in Commodore.
Made it so that we shipped the product. There was drive, of course, that had to write and match it on the drive side too. Right. So it was like we were changing, 2 core ROMs that we were going to go into mass production with. Now we still made them in $50 EEPROMs back in that time for a while, but and then I thought I was going to be able to correct it in the 64, and that's when I got noticed by the layout guys. So because we had the new 6526, which would work, and I had the code written and everything.
And they didn't run the pins or something?
I didn't have time to test it, and I didn't have. We weren't able to yet change the 1540 drive. It wasn't the 1541 yet at that point in time. It was still the 1540
because the DMA latency was.
And that was a production unit, and we had there was nobody left to do drive work. This was before Greg Berlin or there were any extra bodies that were quote drive people working on it. It was kind of like we had something that works. Everybody that knew how the drive technology kind of worked and left at that point in time. So there was nobody was maintaining really the drive side of things. You were just kind of running on, what the guys had done with the 8250s and stuff like that in the previous generations. So it was a matter of, I had 2 traces that, of course, connected to the same pins on the board.
Right.
And 2 of the traces were obviously used because they're the same as the VIC-20, but then the other 2 traces were from the 6526, which are about high speed, equivalent to what the 6522 was supposed to do in the first place. Well, the production design people said, well, that's stupid. There's two traces
Oh,
that
I
go to
remember
the
that.
same pin. So they deleted those two traces that didn't hook.
It was like the Japanese form of electrical rule checking. Two things. I remember that.
So it was kind of like, whoops, there went my chance to fix it.
Fix the serial bus.
I mean, it wasn't like they were they were I/O pins, so they could actually be shorted together and not have any effect. But
I used to
That's a way for us.
during the C128 time. I used to carry a Mach 5 cartridge in my back pocket, and I used it for two reasons. It would get me into 64 mode just by booting it up, but it would also be a fast serial bus then once it came up. So that was my answer to it back in our time.
Well, I mean, but you see, I kind of wasn't really paying that much attention how fast and slow things were, because by that time I'd already done my own, IEEE 488 card that plugged into 20s and 64s, and everything I used were all dual drives or something like that.
Freddie Bowen had the drive collection. If you wanted a drive copy to Commodore, you went to Fred Bowen. He had the bank of drives.
All these different drives, yeah.
We were talking about Bowen a second ago. The thing, a couple of days ago, or a couple of weeks ago, we've been talking about MMUs. We were talking with younger employees who don't really understand there was a time before MMUs and what they did. And I almost said, I think I designed or laid out, specified the first consumer MMU for a home computer product. It would have been the C128's MMU. But I stopped short of saying that because I made there was one thing I didn't include in the MMU that would really qualify as an MMU, and that was a supervisor mode where you could distinguish between the user making calls to the MMU and was in things that the kernel was allowed to do that nobody else was allowed to do. So everything I put into the MMU, I put in there for Fred Bowen to use. Like, Fred, you can bank this, you can bank that, your life will be great and all this. And I'd actually read a book by Tracy Kidder called Soul of a Machine, and they had bitched about the supervisor mode in there. And so I thought, well, I won't put one in. So I was influenced. I didn't even, I was young. What can I say, 23, 24. So one day, and it was long after there's any chance we can do anything about it, Fred said something. I said, well, Fred, why don't you use bank mode 4 or something like that? He said, therefore the user. What? Therefore the user. I don't. It's like the Tron thing, or he had such a respect for the end users that he wouldn't touch the MMU banks. He said, I don't know what they're going to do to it, so I don't touch it. And at the end of the day, he was absolutely right. He made it so that we never had crap turning on and off by itself and stuff because of interactions between the kernels and the users. And shame on me for not having really thought about, well, I'm trying to get this guy something independent of everybody else. So I can say I did the almost first MMU because then it's just a fancy banker and mode manager if you don't have a supervisor mode. I mean, I realize that now. So, but that was one of my early memories of Freddie. Terry Ryan was the guy that wrote BASIC during the C128 and the Plus 4. And we still tease him today because he got in trouble for doing such a great job. He did version 7.0 BASIC that had loop while, do loop, all this structure. He brought structure to BASIC, and he almost lost his job for it. Because his boss, Julian, who saw the benefit in not making a decision, which in Commodore world was just like the death knell. Had told him, well, don't you dare put structure into it, without understanding the premise behind it or anything or what. And Ryan did anyways, and thank goodness. I mean, he single-handedly. I mean, if that thing shipped to several million, home people, he single-handedly upped the stakes of home computers by 1% himself. Just he brought structure to it. And that was what was cool at working on Commodore, was you could slide stuff in and make a little bit of difference on your own. I mean, we were told to botch the video disc thing, and we didn't. I mean, all the things we did on our own, building in Z80s, that was our idea. That wasn't, you may not like it, but it was the first dual processor home computer out in the market because of it, and fixed some of the Z80 cartridge problems.
The first one that flipped between different OSs.
Yeah, could have had a couple of OSs. Though CPM wasn't native, though, was it? But we had the banking, so you had to load the disk.
You had to boot the disk,
which was a great memory test. If anything was wrong in the computer, the CPM wouldn't boot off the disk. So it's the other thing I remember. You're part of the team that made the Commodore 64 not sparkle anymore. or made it so it shipped. Was that
well, I mean,
was Pruden on there?
we did the phase lock loop stuff. I mean, that was just because we were the ones that screwed it up in the first place.
Well, but you did even when you had legitimate sparkle though. I don't mean artifacts, but the VIC chip used to the foreground and background colors would bleed in each other, and so you set the foreground and background color to the same color. So it's still sparkle, but it's just dark blue and dark blue.
When we did the very first prototypes, we had a VIC chip that was only for the USA. Okay, I mean, that's all Al Charpentier did. But then we realized, okay, now we got Europe to deal with. And, I didn't want to have multiple clock speeds on stuff. But at the same time, we wanted to have one chip to do that. So, the color burst frequencies being wrong meant that we had to, choose which way it was going to work. So we got the clocks so they were close, but we never really thought about the fact that you would have a frequency beat between the color burst versus your other clocks in there. So it was one of those things we kind of we had it working, everything was great until we, did the production quote chip, and then all of a sudden it's like, now what the heck is this about? We did, it was just the early days, our inexperience, whatever, showed up, and it was like, oh man, now we got this problem. And Jack is like, I thought we were going to ship in March, and it doesn't look like we're going to ship till June or whatever now. So, and we had said like, oh yeah, we're ready to go back in December at the CES show. So.
I think Jerry Ellsworth asked me, how'd you guys do all that clock stuff in the beginning? My answer was badly. I think we had to learn everything the hard way with what artifacting and synchro. I mean, and then we still learned it in the 8563, where I didn't catch. I was too young to know what a second oscillator. Just basically two oscillators on one board is bad. There's nothing good that could come from it. The 8563 had its own 16 meg, and we rescued the CES show by making a phase lock loop tower that basically took the frequencies that existed and doubled them and made the frequencies we needed. And then ever since since then, any design I've ever had never had one more than one clock on it, literally, unless it's like the real-time clock oscillator.
Well, I actually had to make that work on the Amiga 2500s, which was our first 25 megahertz Amiga. We had a 25 megahertz, we had a 28 megahertz fundamental frequency on the motherboard and a 25 megahertz fundamental frequency on the CPU.
I didn't know that.
I figured out how to get all the stuff synchronized without any clock splintering or.
It's possible. It's just you gotta do more than just.
You really have to know what you're doing, and you have to look for points of synchronization failure, and it's real hard to do. And even at that, my solution was kind of a hack, but it worked. Right. So it required a tap delay, which is a big no-no. You're never supposed to use tap delay.
Well, we couldn't because they were expensive. They cost $1 back in our day. And oh my goodness!
Yeah, well, these originally sold for like $4,000. It's hard to imagine anyone buying that, spending that kind of money on a computer, but back then especially. But they did, even with the Commodore name on it.
Well, let's wrap this up. People have heard us babble a little bit, but I wanted to hear, people don't hear Bob's name a lot, and he was, when we got there, he was the old man, and he was, how old were you, 24?
Probably, yeah.
But he was like the guy we were like, wow, he was the guy you couldn't touch. Jack Tramiel had said, touch him and die, and so it was cool. You could walk in his shadow and be sticking your tongue out at other people and stuff and things. So
the great Jack Tramiel card, yeah.
Yeah, he knew Jack. We
didn't know Jack.
We stood this high. We stood this high when a Jack attack came, and everybody in the room, my bosses would be gone. Jack. The way I knew Jack, he would shout a question to the room, and I'd answer, but he didn't turn to me and say, "Bill heard it." He had no idea who I was, but he knew him. Well, you got in trouble one time.
Yeah, I mean, I actually had a major Jack attack.
Yeah, you survived.
Yeah, because I learned the fundamental thing about Jack was a pretty simple fundamental thing, but if you're in the heat of the moment, you miss it. The thing is Jack was trying to teach you a lesson, and he wanted you to have a clear indication from you that you understood how you'd screwed up, whether it was your fault or not your fault. He wanted to have it you understood, and you were not going to let it happen again.
I think my drill sergeant was the same way.
That's what it was all about. But a lot of people, their egos and stuff got involved, and Jack torpedoed them, or they walked out of there and never came back. And, I said, yes, sir, it'll never happen again. Absolutely not. And I came out of the office, and the secretaries and everybody were like, you're still working here? It's like, yep.
Well, what happened? You guys arrived at a show and the VIC-20 didn't?
I flew out from California, from that group to a show out here, and I was carrying the one and only VIC-20 at that point in time because I was kind of in charge of the whole thing. And my bosses out there, I can't remember who they were because they were inconsequential, but they were like, you have to, you can't take it as carry-on. I have it like all packed to take. No, you can't take it as carry-on. Just, you got to safely pack it more securely.
Artificial intelligence.
And so we'll send it as luggage. We'll put it on as luggage. So I went there and made sure the guy put on luggage. Of course, typical airlines. I arrive in Philadelphia. Hey, where's my luggage? Who knows? Filed a claim. So I'm like, have to go all the way out. And so we're waiting for, whoever flew me out here, United or whatever, to show but the lost luggage.
Lost VIC-20.
So Jack has got,
VIC-20.
A whole presentation, everything built around, and there's nothing but these. So.
This lesson was not lost on some of us who came later because we always brought our prototypes on as personal carry-ons, regardless of what anybody said about it.
The trip out to CES, you could tell Commodore. I mean, one year I carried power supplies of all things, just like 70 pounds, and we all knew each other in the airport because you'd see us with Commodore boxes, and that's how we traveled.
When I did the Hanover shows, I used to be there with 20 boxes. I used to have these shopping carts. I'd be trying to get through customs, and they'd be standing there with their machine guns, okay, you go over here, watching me with the machine guns, because I'd have so many boxes of Commodore stuff that I was personally making sure arrived.
Or something. Okay,
cool. After whatever.
It's going to be set up. You might as well have some people there.
I was going to say one day we'll have juicy tidbits that you can edit out and blackmail people with.
I do that already. Shall we fly?
I just ordered more sushi, so.
Okay.
Did you eat already?
It's just one of my 30-cent cheap lunches.
Okay.
Because
you used to hang with the best of the sushi eaters.
It doesn't stack up at all. Yeah, that's the only problem. No, I mean, believe me, I can finish up on these platters, no problem.
Okay.
That's good stuff.
I'm just moderating myself.
That's what I'm saying. You don't have to.
So, who was this you were talking about? Radigan? But who's the one you backed into?
It was Copperman.
And who was Copperman?
Eric Copperman was up. I guess he was head of the USA, not head of all Commodore.
But he somehow sat up in the front office, didn't he?
He came in.
He somehow got up into what was Jack's office in my mind.
Yeah.
Even though he didn't
Over where the shower was.
He didn't seem to have the same power as Radigan.
I think he was. I think he was in charge. He was basically in charge of Commodore Business Machines, all of the USA. He was the one who came in and had broken it up into divisions, and they had an educational division, a consumer division, a government division, and I think one other. And in typical fashion, they gave him a year to do this, and it was a 3-year job, and so nothing ever really happened.
Yeah, I mean, basically, he's the one who really restructured, but then did that structure really stick? I didn't think it really lasted any longer than kind of him. It just they brought in some more management to implement the structure.
Well, part of the problem was that every time they brought in new management, it was their gig, and then they left, and the next guy had to deconstruct that and put in whatever they wanted. Or they just were totally clueless and they didn't know what to do with what had been put in there before.
Well, I remember back when I was there, the educational division consisted of Barbara Felden, which I always remember the name, right, from Good Smart. And her memo of somebody had made the mailbox names blue for the men and pink for the women or something, and that's it. That set her off. It's but I haven't seen any memos about how to penetrate the educational market. Why is this the thing I hear about? Yes, I agree. You shouldn't discriminate based on the color of a mailbox, but why is Apple kicking her ass in the school?
Right.
I think they had one effective person in education. Kind of got some traction, and then they got rid of him. I can't really remember who it was, but I think he was one of those ones that was pretty politically incorrect, even for that era.
probably promoted to his level of incompetence, and since he was competent, he had to be kicked out.
Well, and I think it was like one of those things that he got himself in trouble with, like the females, as a block in general or something.
Okay.
He did some bonehead move that kind of like got him, pointed out the door, and then they found a reason to go ahead, and give him the real boot. So I just don't remember who that guy was, but I do know that we had some traction for a while with educational, mainly because we were so cheap.
Well, that was always a big issue.
They were selling what? They were selling the pets. Well, they were selling the 64s inside the pet boxes, right? That was the type of thing. It seemed like sometimes Irving kind of held that head of the corporate world, and Radigan was like the one he gave it up for. And I don't know how much he really gave it up until all the way like Betty or something. I'm not quite
Well, the
sure.
story I heard about Radigan was Radigan basically, was put in that position, but Gould was still pulling strings here and there, and Radigan tried to make a move. Ironically, the same move that Mehdi made years later, and basically install all of his people, which is the only way to really preserve his power there.
Right.
And that's what got him canned. That was the story that we heard. Not the one that was published in the Wall Street Journal or anything. But.
Now, see, I heard or reading Bagnall's book. The part of the tension between Tramiel and Gould was Tramiel putting the Suns in place.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Which to me seemed perfectly fine. I mean,
that
it's like that's because I was a good old Tramiel soldier,
Yeah.
But that was what the ultimate argument that I overheard.
Which is a weird, of all things, to argue with.
Whether that was, the tiny thing that broke the camel's back or the bigger thing. I mean, when they were going at it there during that show, I guess that was a CES show or whatever, that Jack got in his car and left type of thing.
Was that a Chicago CES?
It was out in Vegas where.
Yeah, that's right. That was a Vegas show in '84. You went there, I didn't. And I remember the picture of Jack with the +4 and the 364 or whatever. And then they had a picture of him that had just made like the national press. That and then at the same time it was being announced that he was leaving.
If you didn't go to...
I went to Chicago.
Right. If you didn't go to the +4 CES, the first one, because you were definitely there for the C128 CES, both of those, who was I hanging around with? It wouldn't have been... Yeah, it was Berlin. Somebody and me, went around terror and told me terror, and of course we did it during the season.
Yeah, it was probably Berlin.
I think Berlin was there when doing the setup when they were fighting too. Because I think there's like somebody else in our group that was like there, overheard the argument.
The booth looked like what was it? Finkel's brother said, Steve Finkel said, a pleasant Swiss Navy ship or something like that. The one you remember was gray and yellow.
Yeah.
The previous year we had a mime. Oh God, what was the guy's name that set up the booth? We're sitting in a bar. Yeah, of course I'm sitting in a bar. I was at every bar in Vegas. I walk in, they know me by name. That was weird. But the guy who ran the show that year, the +4 year at Vegas, he's sitting there and we start talking. And these two chicks naturally to the side of us. And I'm like, well, he goes, well, I produced the Mike Douglas show and stuff like that. I'm like, all right, stop lying. I'm thinking to myself. Turns out, no, that was his claim to fame. He was a producer of, the Mike Douglas show was done in Philadelphia and stuff, which I hadn't known.
Yeah, I think it was like Atlantic City, Philadelphia.
Yeah, and so he really was, so he worked for, so he really was using a great pickup line, and as it turned out. But the difference in the show was, he had a mime and a magician. You remember the magician?
I remember the magician.
Oh, man, I was going to deck him one night.
I remember the mime and the magician.
The magician took himself way too seriously. The mime was serious in his trade and in that. He really didn't want, his name was Egg, and he really didn't want to talk, when he was in the whiteface. But I ran into him at a completely different show. And we looked, I'm like, Egg, and he's like, Bill, and we're over there talking. And now he's talking, and he's talking on somebody else's time, and you see the owner of his booth like, why is my mime over there talking to that long-haired guy? He's not supposed to be talking. So, we were just so happy to see, we felt like we'd been to a CES here. But then the next year, Gilbreth's wife, what's her name? Just escapes me at the moment. We were good friends with her. Ann? She ran the next show, and it was just a real classy affair, compared to the mimes and the. So that's right.
In the earlier shows, the biggest thing we had was like the Playboy bunnies and stuff like that. That was like
was that the Gould era?
I mean, basically, I know that was like the Jack era. I mean, basically, we'd drag a whole bunch of stuff and into there, and like, okay, we're going to put up our tables and dress it, and hey, let's run down and get some big screen TVs to show the VIC 20 on type stuff. I still remember I was Mike Tomczyk like driving someplace to get a big screen TV. It's like the night before the show. We're like driving in the rain in Vegas. Yeah, that was like Mike Tomczyk. I'm such a master of planning. It's like, I remember that.
I wonder. One day I realized he was an expert on big screen TVs. I said, "Well, the liquid cooled thing, it's available in Taiwan for so much." I'm like, "All right, just another thing Russell's an expert in." Now I know why.
I think he probably had the first big screen TV of anyone I knew.
That's where the contrast ratios, where you stood in a dark room right in the center.
The guy who had the first one always was Mike Harris. I mean, he was the one that was crazy.
Okay, Mike. He also had the money, I guess.
Yeah, he would like drop $8,000 on the TV, and it was just like, I'm sorry, my head, 3 or 4 I could see, but $8,000.
Well, that's it. That's about where. Yeah, I guess that's about right. Yeah, I guess. Oh yeah, and Eric Quackenbush was another one too.
Yeah, Eric was a real early one.
He had way too many toys.
Didn't know.
He had 2 digital high definition decks, or actually they eventually 2 DVHS decks before you could actually get any high definition.
Yeah, he got the DVHS stuff. Yeah.
But I remember the Chicago +4 CES. We were right next to Coleco, and we kept torturing.
Well, the one CS where they were releasing the Atom that had the Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, that one video disc game that was real bad. It would break up in static and suddenly you'd go to the left instead of the right and static, and you'd see him die or something like that.
Yeah. What the heck was it?
But it was
it was the one that had it on Laserdisc.
Right.
Was that? Where did they introduce the Coleco Atom, though? I thought that was CES where they actually did that. And then
we had gone and grabbed one before the CES, so we knew not to be worried about it, because I had seen, of all people, I'd seen Yash Tarakura walking by with the box, and then I get a phone call from Nancy Ron to Adam's office. I'm like, okay, cool. So I was part of the people, and we all went in there, Shiraz went in there, we all opened it up. And, what you would have seen from the outside is the door closed. Everybody goes in there and the door closes, and we're all kind of tense. And we come out, and our shoulders are back, and we're laughing, and just, catch you tonight at the bar and stuff. It was such a, it was a 32 column, and it had so much color artifact. We couldn't talk while the cassette player was running. We heard it had this advanced data tape mechanism. It was a cassette drive, that's all.
Oh, that was the new one, though. The one they showed off at
that was the CDS. Atom, then.
That was the Atom. Yeah,
the other one had the Apple.
The Atom had a high-speed tape drive that could be reversed under computer control. But they couldn't get it to work.
That was the one they had the real tricky.
Well, that's what I'm calling the cassette deck. It was still just a cassette deck at the end of the day.
It was pretty tricky at that time. And we were like looking at the price of
You might have been in the room. Were you in the room when we unboxed the Atom?
I remember. But I'd
seen like 6 or 7 of us in the room.
I'd seen it. I saw it at a CES when they were announcing it, but I don't think they had any access. It was more like a pre-announcement.
What they had, the Apple emulation was an Apple under the desk. It really was. I mean, it wasn't even much of and Commodore never did that kind of thing, right?
Never.
But they came over to the booth, and they asked for a cable, and it was Charlie Winterbull. It wasn't him, but Charlie had sent somebody over to our booth to get a cable, like one of the Commodore cables, so they could plug into the Apple. Turns out it was like used the same kind of thing or something. And somebody was giving this kid a hard time. Is like, it said Coleco on his badge. I'm like, whoa, what's going on? You're from Coleco and you need a cable? Here's to you, man. Here's a cable. Tell Charlie I said hi. Because it's more like the brotherhood of the people who killed themselves to get to CES show. Yeah. I had more in common with this guy than I did the guy giving him a hard time that had the Commodore badge on.
Yeah.
I'm like, here you go, man. You need anything, you come back, you tell Charlie Bill Hurt said hi. I know he doesn't know who I am, but one day I did run into him on the phone. But that was, and it was funny because he's like,
the Atom, you should see what they did to my beautiful creature. I'm like, I know all about it. He said, I had a Z80 running so much fast. I didn't say no way. They took my MMU out. No, I believe you, man.
Been there, got the t-shirt.
Bunch of
Well, Fred didn't really do anything, so you know, I say bad attitude. But Fred's most of his claim to fame is stuff I don't even know about, like, you know, Commodore 65s and stuff like that.
This very day, I got an email asking about the C65. It's like, I don't know. I knew it existed. That's about my extent of knowledge.
I have an email I got to return. Somebody was talking about the vintage computer festival.
Yeah.
And we had all these 665s. And you know, if ever I were to let my ego out of the box, it'd be that the C65, I'd hear about it.
Yeah.
I didn't work there. Matter of fact, I could have used a job at the time.
Right.
And I'm hearing, and I would sit there and go, don't let the chip designer do that. I would get myself worked up, and I'm like, they need me in there. I could, you know.
It really did.
Well, that was the whole problem with the C65. It was nothing but a chip design.
And nobody would.
Got chip design. You had
And nobody would even give me the time of day to interview.
Paul Lassa looking after the hardware.
Yeah.
Not, he didn't really have much to do because it was chip designs and it was Fish laying out the circuit board. He basically just had to coordinate the two.
Yeah.
Fred trying to figure out how incompatible it really was.
Right. And nobody beating up on anybody
To get it right. So Gardai's just doing it the way he wants. And yeah, so if anything, I always felt a pang that I could have done some good. You know, I always felt like I was where I needed to be and did the things I could. But then I'd hear about the C65. I said, oh man.
Does anybody know where Gardai actually went to, disappeared into? I can't imagine that's such a lone
The thing that irritated me later after the LCD design, after we turned that over and we're working on the 128, was I had set the whole MMU structure up to have a page pointer into memory so you could edit a text file. And it's just, you're just moving, because how long does it take to move 80 character? You know, it took a while. You see a scroll.
Do that stuff. Yeah.
And I found out that they never used it, and it was because the 25th line for function keys, they're like, well, there's no way to do that. I'm like, you know, the chip designers pushed back. There was no, you tell them to create a register. It points to where you put the function line, and you make them insert. They can do that. When they get to the 25th row, they get the text from somewhere else.
Place, yeah.
and so, because nobody stood up to Rabel in particular, but the chip group, the function I left laying there juicy, and it's no big thing, but it was just like one of those
cool things.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's what made those computers. Was all, somebody came up with this really cool way of doing something that would have been hard to do otherwise.
Honestly, that was the thing that was always neat to me about the 64s. I still remember sitting there with Charpentier and Yanis, and we're like talking about how things like not only the SID but the new VIC chip was being, how the sprites were going to work, and we're going like, we got to tighten this logic up and it's like, no, let's just make it so that it's just another state, So if there's 8 states that are possible, all 8 states
have
are
a chance
possible.
to meet Bob.
Let's not turn them off just because we don't know.
I think what we'll do, let's call this an interview with Bob Russell, and then let's do an actual greeting here in a second. That might be cool. So I probably just ruined the end of this, but so yeah, cool. You'll edit this.
I'll edit it.
You'll edit it. Yeah, I'll be good at that.
What?
Still get pretty good at that. I imagine.
I have been very